Rain poured over the marble steps of the mansion as the young woman clutched her worn suitcase with trembling hands, her knuckles pale beneath the cold water running down her arms. She had knocked on more doors that week than she could count, and every single one had closed before she could finish her sentence. 28 years old, alone in a city that no longer recognized her name, she stood at the base of those steps and told herself this would be the last door she tried. The porch light above her flickered against the storm, illuminating a face that was tired but not broken, soaked but not defeated. When the door finally opened, she found herself looking up at a man who did not bother to look down. "Please," she said, her voice barely rising above the rain. "Let me stay. I won't let you down." He did not lift his eyes from the papers in his hand. "I don't hire charity cases," he said, and the door began to close. She nodded once, wiped the rain or the tears from her face. No one could tell which, and turned to walk back into the storm. But what fell from the side pocket of her backpack in that moment, unnoticed by her, would soon make its way into his hands. And it would force him to question everything he had ever believed about trust, about loyalty, and about the woman he had almost let walk away forever. Her name was Maya Carter. And by the time she reached that mansion, she had already lost everything a person could lose without losing her own spine. She had been raised by a foster mother who taught her that dignity was not something money could buy or poverty could take away. And she carried that lesson the way other people carried photographs. 2 weeks earlier, she had lost her job when the small accounting firm she worked for closed its doors without warning. And 10 days after that, her landlord had changed the locks because she could not make rent. She owned little now beyond the suitcase in her hand, a few crumpled bills in her coat pocket, and a quiet, stubborn refusal to ask anyone for pity. She did not cry in front of strangers, and she had not cried in front of anyone since the funeral that changed her life 2 years before. What she carried instead of self-pity was patience, an unusual stillness that made people underestimate her, and a sharp mind she had learned to keep hidden behind a soft voice. She had studied accounting in college on borrowed time and borrowed money, finishing her degree while working 2 jobs, never once missing a deadline, despite circumstances that would have given most people every excuse to fail. Eleanor had told her once that the world would forgive a poor woman for many things, but it would never forgive her for being unprepared. And Maya had carried that warning with her into every interview, every job, every quiet humiliation she had learned to absorb without letting it reach her face. The city she walked through that night had never been gentle with people who looked like her or carried as little as she did, and she had long since stopped expecting it to be. The mansion she stood before that evening was not chosen by accident, though it might have looked that way to anyone watching from the street. A neighbor in her old building had mentioned, almost in passing, that the big house on the hill was looking for temporary help after its longtime butler had resigned, and Maya had memorized the address, the way a drowning person memorizes the shape of the nearest shore. She had nothing to lose by trying, and everything to lose by not trying. And so she had walked the entire distance through the rain rather than spend the last of her money on a bus fare she might need later for something more urgent. By the time she reached the gate, her shoes were soaked through, and her hands had stopped feeling the cold entirely, but her resolve had not weakened even slightly. The man who closed the door on her was Marcus Hale, 40 years old, the founder and sole owner of one of the city's most powerful investment firms. A man whose name appeared in financial papers far more often than it appeared in any personal conversation. He lived alone in a mansion built for a family he no longer believed he would ever have, in rooms that echoed instead of welcomed. People who worked for him respected him, feared him a little, and almost never claimed to know him. He had built an empire from nothing through a discipline that bordered on cruelty toward himself first and only afterward toward everyone around him. Somewhere along the way he had decided that warmth was a weakness other people used against him, and so he had simply stopped offering it. He trusted no one completely because in his experience everyone who came close eventually wanted something, and the closer they got the more expensive that something turned out to be. He had built his firm from a single rented office and a handful of small clients, working nights and weekends for years until the business outgrew every room he put it in. And somewhere in that climb, he had quietly buried the version of himself that once believed people stayed because they cared rather than because they needed something. By 40, he employed more than 1,000 people across 3 cities, and not one of them, as far as he knew, had ever seen the inside of his actual home. The mansion had run on the quiet competence of one man for nearly 15 years, a butler and household manager named Walter Briggs, who had served Marcus since before the company had its first office. It was Walter's sudden resignation, forced by his wife's failing health and his own exhaustion, that left the house without anyone to manage it, just 2 days before Maya appeared on the steps in the rain. Marcus had refused 3 separate placement agencies that week, calling each candidate either incompetent or untrustworthy within minutes of meeting them. He did not need company. He needed silence, order, and a house that ran itself without requiring anything emotional from him in return. When Maya knocked, she had no idea a position even existed. She had simply heard from a neighbor that the house was looking for help, and she had walked the entire distance in the rain because she had no money left for a bus. After the door closed on her, Maya did not go far. She sat beneath the stone archway at the edge of the property, telling herself she only needed a moment to gather the strength to keep walking. When Walter Briggs found her there on his way out to his car, he recognized something in her, perhaps the same quiet endurance he had once carried himself in younger years, and he turned back toward the house instead of driving away. He went inside and found Marcus still standing over his desk. The same papers untouched in his hand. And he made one final request before he left for good. "Give her 1 week," Walter said. "If she fails, I will never ask you for anything again." Marcus exhaled through his nose, the closest thing to agreement he allowed himself, and told Walter to bring her back inside before she caught a fever standing in his driveway. The conditions were laid out before Maya had even removed her wet coat, delivered in a tone that made clear they were not negotiable. She was not to go upstairs to the 2nd floor under any circumstance. She was not to enter his private study regardless of the reason. She was not to ask him personal questions about his family, his past, or his life outside the company. One mistake, he told her, and she would be gone before the sun set on the same day. Maya listened without flinching, without asking why, without trying to soften the harshness of his words with a smile she did not feel. "I understand," she said simply, and something about the absence of protest, the absence of pleading, made Walter glance toward Marcus with quiet surprise. Marcus said nothing. He simply turned and walked toward the stairs, leaving her standing alone in the entryway of a house far larger and colder than anything she had ever lived in before. In the days that followed, the staff who still came occasionally, a groundskeeper, a delivery driver, a contracted chef who visited twice a week, began to notice something unusual about the new woman who had quietly taken over the household. She woke before sunrise and worked until well after dark, never once complaining about the hours or the silence that surrounded her. She did not gossip about her employer the way previous staff sometimes had, and she did not ask for shortcuts or favors. When something was broken, she repaired it herself rather than waiting for someone else to notice. The groundskeeper, an older man who had worked the property for over a decade, found her one afternoon repairing a section of fence that had been loose for months, doing it cleanly and without being asked, and he stood there longer than he meant to, simply watching her work with an expression he could not quite explain to himself later. He asked her, almost without thinking, why she bothered fixing something no one had even mentioned. And she told him simply that a thing left broken long enough eventually stopped looking worth fixing at all, and she preferred not to let anything around her reach that point if she could help it. He thought about that sentence for the rest of the day, turning it over the way a man turns over a coin he is not sure he should keep. By the end of her first week, the staff who passed through occasionally had stopped asking how long she planned to stay and started simply hoping she would. The mansion itself, despite its size and its wealth, had the particular emptiness of a place built to impress rather than to live in. Dinner was served for one every evening. The long dining table set with more silverware than any single person could possibly use. The silence in the room broken only by the occasional sound of a fork against porcelain. There was no music playing anywhere in the house, no photographs of family lining the hallways, no laughter drifting down from another room. Maya noticed this within her first few days. The way the house felt less like a home and more like a beautifully decorated waiting room, as though everyone inside it was simply enduring time rather than living it. She said nothing about it at first. She simply watched the way she watched everything, quietly cataloging what was missing before she ever tried to fill it. She noticed the way he walked through his own hallways like a guest rather than an owner. Never lingering, never touching the art on the walls or the books on the shelves, moving through his home the way a man moves through an airport between flights he does not particularly want to take. She noticed too that he kept a single chair in the study angled slightly away from the window, as though even sunlight asked more of him than he was willing to give some days. None of it was said aloud between them. Not yet. But she began to understand that the silence in that house was not peace at all, only the absence of anyone willing to break it. One evening, a storm knocked out the power across the entire property, plunging the mansion into total darkness without warning. Maya moved instinctively toward the kitchen to find candles, the way she had learned to do in apartments where the electricity was often the first thing to go when money ran short. On her way past the study, she saw him through the open door, sitting alone at his desk in the dark, not reaching for a phone, not calling for help, simply sitting there with his hands folded as though darkness were nothing new to him at all. He had not eaten dinner. He had not turned on a single light even before the power went out. In that moment, watching the most powerful man in the city sit motionless in his own shadow, Maya understood something that no financial report could ever have told her. The richest man she had ever met was also without question the loneliest person she had ever seen in her life. She did not mention what she had witnessed that night. Not to him, not to anyone, but something in her shifted afterward. A quiet decision forming without a single word being spoken aloud. No one had asked her to do anything beyond the basic duties of running the house. Yet, she began making small changes that no one had requested. She planted fresh flowers along the windowsills facing the garden, the kind that needed almost no water, but